So welcome everybody to the Yorktivist Human Rights Film Festival. We are here tonight to speak with Karen Anstee about her wonderful film, Rachel. And hopefully she'll be able to tell us a little bit about other projects that she's working on at the moment. My name is Vanessa Charters. I'm on the organising committee for Yorktivist. So Karen, can I pass over to you? Would you mind to just sort of like tell us a little bit about yourself and like, you know, sort of we'll start with maybe what was the inspiration?
Well, I started out life as a musician, trained as a violinist at the Royal Academy of Music. And then after many years of doing that, I suddenly thought I really couldn't do many more things with that, except I still haven't played Glastonbury. So if anyone out there wants to put me in a band, that would be great. But so I went to London Film School and did a screenwriting course because years ago I'd been trying to write and I'd had an idea for a film. So I did the master's in screenwriting, and after that I set about trying to find a director to make my scripts. And that proved quite complicated because the writer-director relationship is really, certainly through that film school, it's very weighted towards the director, and it's a very male dominated scene as well. So after a certain amount of time I just got sick of that and decided I would just try directing myself. And I had been to the London Film Festival had a Women in Film and TV event with Gina Davis of Thelma and Louise fame. And she does a lot of work in encouraging women onto the screen and to put more women on the screen and more female stories. And at that event, I met the director of photography, Tanya Frymouth, and I talked to her about my project, and that was how I ended up directing it. And yes, and it's just gone on from there, and I can tell you more about the rest of the things I've done since. But Rachel itself, it came out of kind of a funny thing where, I don't know if you know the Jewish tradition where when someone dies, you know, their funeral's the next day, and then a year later you come back and you put a stone on their grave. And then thereafter, every time you visit, you put a stone to say that you were there. And it's a beautiful tradition because it acknowledges that grief doesn't end immediately after the funeral. And I think it was born out of their nomadic lifestyle, coming back once a year via the same piece of land and visiting each person who they'd left along the way. But my father-in-law had died, sadly, of motor neuron disease, and we went for his stone laying in New York. And afterwards at the meal, my mother-in-law said, yeah, I don't want any of this fuss, none of this. Yeah, I just want to be cremated, don't want any. And then this huge family row erupted where her daughter was like, Mummy, you're going in that grave next to Daddy, we've paid for it, and that's where you belong, and that's our tradition, and I'm not cremating you, that's against our religion, blah. And it really set me thinking, because I thought, who is the funeral for? Whose rights matter in this? My mother-in-law's an atheist. Why should she have to live by a tradition that she doesn't believe in? I mean, she's proud to be Jewish, but it's not her tradition in that sense. And so out of that, plus a whole load of other things that had happened to me around loss, when my father died when I was a teenager, and it all poured into Rachel. And the irony being then, when I finally showed my mother-in-law this film, and she's like, wow, you know, this is great, but where did you come up with the idea? And I told her that it was from her having that conversation, and she's like, yeah, what do I care? I'll be dead. And that was it. And she just was like, she really didn't care. She just liked having the argument. But yeah, anyway, so that's where Rachel came from.
That's a lovely story. And we've got a comment from Helen who says that the Stones is a lovely tradition. It holds space to remember someone in a more ritualized way than just generally day-to-day remembering. And that's from a non-Jewish perspective.
Yeah.
Now, somebody's asked for live transcription. I shall try to enable that. forgive me that that it hasn't been on before. I hope that this works. Oh yes, there we are.
Cool.
It's working. That's lovely. No, what a wonderful tradition. One of the things that I thought was lovely, and you mentioned before about the music, and like, you know, with you being as a trained musician, your use of music in the film was just so beautiful because it opens, and I believe that's you actually playing, isn't it, in the
Yes,
opening?
it is. Yeah.
Opening bit. Like, no wonder you went to the Royal Academy. but sort of it goes from, you know, that kind of mournful tune, and then when they're in the room with Rachel,
Yeah.
there's no music. It's very harsh. It's arguing, and
Yeah.
then after that, it becomes this like lovely, happy tune as he goes to the you know, to collect her ashes.
Yeah.
And it's what sort of brought you to those musical decisions?
Well, it is kind of the musical story is interesting in that when I lived and studied and worked in Boston playing the violin, and there was a musician outside I worked in the body shop part-time to support my studies, and there was a musician who used to play outside, and he had this amazing song, which is not the one that's in the film, but originally when I wrote the script, I wrote this song in because it was so beautiful. It was I'm going down to the ocean, I'm going to take my baby with me. And it was just this amazing, raucous, like turning his back to the storm. And I was just so in love with that. And I kind of wove it into the story. And this is the problem with filmmaking, is you make these decisions and then you're like brokenhearted. Because I wrote to him and he said, sure, when you get the funds together, when you've made the film up, yeah, get in touch and we'll just, you know, we'll organize something. And then when I finally got the funds, thanks to the huge kindness of strangers and friends on, you know, via Kickstarter, and I wrote to him and said, all right, I'm ready. I just want to sign something. So I want to give you money for your music because I'm a musician. And can we talk about that? And then I heard nothing from him. And then nothing again and nothing again. And then I went searching for him. I looked him up where he was playing in California by the sea, and they hadn't seen him for a year. I wrote to old friends of his in Boston and couldn't find him. And in the end, I had to make this decision to let his music go and to find another song. But I wanted it to be a joyous song and to be something that wouldn't leave you. I mean, the end of the film is sad, but to leave you with the sense that this was a positive thing. And so then I had to find another song. And luckily I did find this wonderful song. And I had to make that choice before we shot the film, because what I did is I actually cut the film with the music and the actor. When we were in the, so we shot actually in a real funeral director's premises. And so when Rob was sitting there, before each scene, he would listen to that music. So although it's not in the room and it's not in that part, he was listening to it to get in touch with the loss and we actually filmed the beach scene first. So it's all very the magic of film and the way it happens. And then ironically, about for a year after the film had premiered, I suddenly get an email from the original folk artist saying, oh yeah, sure, you can use my film, my music for your film. And by then it was too late, but I love the music that I have there. So maybe one day I'll do another film with his music, but
oh yeah.
Yeah,
nice one to keep in your back pocket for.
Yeah, it's about that kind of that sense of the father alone, the violin alone at the beginning. I did not want to overuse music. I hate when I watch films and where there's an absence of feeling, that people try to use music to put it there, and so I wanted that scene in that funeral director's space to feel the way it does when you have lost someone. And it is my very worst memory is having to go and see my father when he had died in one of those places, and the bizarreness of there being, you know, like a tattoo parlor one side and a Greg's bakery the other, and how all this huge emotion is happening in this bizarrely ordinary place on a shopping parade. It's sort of yeah, and so I wanted it to be empty and feel claustrophobic and feel difficult to watch, because we're so used to getting prompted and saved by music. Sorry, I'm rattling on about it. But
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. And like, you know, where it becomes more obvious when you see a film such as Rachel, where it's done beautifully, and then, like, you know, going back and watching other films where, as you say, like, they use the music to save the emotion, and you think, oh, just jars. But we've got another lovely comment here from Helen, who says, I loved that Rachel had a voice in the film. It would have been less empowering if she hadn't. And the music weaves through the story. Interesting that he listened to it pre-filming. So I think you saw it you really did see it in his face, in his demeanor.
Yeah, and the first draft or so I wrote of the script, she didn't have a voice, and it was just so obviously missing. And I have, because there's this whole thing of the Bechdel test, where it's like, you know, does the woman on screen talk more? Is it her story? You know, and so I've received some criticism for the film because, you know, Rachel's dead and people feel it's about the men, and I'm like, to my mind, she is the one in power all the way through. She's making her demands felt. She wants what she wants. She's made her decisions. She's taken control. And these men are sort of helpless within that her strength is that she still has a voice even when she's gone, because she's self-determined what she wants and taken the right action to get that. And so I see it as a very powerful female film, but you know, some people don't. It's just, that's the thing about film.
Yeah, no, Helen and I both agree with this. It was about her fighting for her rights. And in terms of human rights and the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, one of the articles in there is the right to, you know, sort of freedom of religion. And really, that was her right, even in death. And this sort of like brings me around to the point of where the film debuted, which was at the Death and the Maiden conference. And also I read that, or you told me that the film is used in therapeutic settings, which I think is just beautiful. Can you talk me through that? Because one of the things I thought was interesting with Death and the Maiden is it's the first time I'd ever heard the term death positive.
Yes, they so that was run by Lucy Coleman Talbot, who is just a remarkable young woman. She's just a phenomenal person, and she sort of organized this conference which ran over multiple days. Winchester University, they had people coming from all over the world to present their papers. So there were coroners, there were funeral directors, you know, police investigators, just a huge gamut of people, goths, you know, it was tattoo artists, whatever. They were just authors. Yeah, it was an incredible collection of people that she managed to pull together. And it's about this thing of how we're all disconnected with death now, because it is tidied away behind a shop front. And even now during COVID, you've got numbers on the news, but, you know, and I know of people who died during this pandemic, but it because we're all locked away, it feels distant. So even someone I've lost who's really close to me, it was still distant. It was more distance than ever before, you know, in not being able to go to a funeral even. And so so the death positive movement is about accepting that we're going to die. It's part of a circle of the way life has to happen, otherwise there'd be no space for anyone. But it's, yeah, it's an interesting thing. They're sort of very gothic, but and yet not, you know, sometimes it's just someone's profession. And And it was so interesting, like being at lunch with a table of 10 people from all over the world with all these different views on death. And yeah, so Death and the Maiden was a brilliant start for the film. And now it's represented by Concord Media, that so universities and various training places come and can use the film through them to teach classes and things. And I think it's been a surprising journey, because obviously I started out just writing a script and I had no idea where that would take me. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about the creative process, is that through that I went to this conference which I would never have gone to otherwise. And the idea that then, I mean, the very first screening was private, and the funeral directors who'd hosted us came to that screening. And it was so interesting because, you know, you put a film out for the first time and you're like, I don't even know how people are going to respond to this. You know, will they see what I see in it? And it was incredible, because there were a couple of people who had to be taken to another room because they were so distraught for their own personal reasons, to do with what the film provoked in them. And then we all went to the bar, and then I thought, oh no, the guys from Leviton's haven't come out. Maybe they didn't like the film. Oh, you know, and my other half went back in and then came back and said, no, they're still discussing the film, and they think you should, you know, should send it to be training funeral directors, because these things happen all the time. This conflict happens every week to them, and it's so important that people talk about it instead of just ignoring it. And so it had a life that I wasn't expecting. You know, I was just trying to show that I could make a film. And now, and obviously to express something I feel is hugely important and meaningful to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate to other people when you do it. So it's been brilliant. Yeah.
And I think, like you, as you say, like the creative process, it really can sort of take you in all different directions. And I'm just going to sort of get back to the film. I thought it was lovely how, even just like sort of how we saw Rachel, how you showed Rachel, you know, when she was in the coffin, we didn't really sort of, we had an impression of it. It was almost sort of like impressionistic. So we had, she sort of like reminded me a bit of Ophelia, in that famous painting, and then we didn't really sort of see her face. And even when he went back to collect her ashes, you know, it's the first time that we sort of see that she has a face, but she's still sort of like middle distance. You don't get to see her up close. And it's only when they're in the van and on the way to the beach, and you've got that beautiful close-up of her face, and you just got this feeling it's like a free spirit, like this is what life is supposed to be like for all. Oh, so here I am, waxing lyrical, but I just thought, was that an effect that you were going for, with like sort of how closely we?
Yeah, it was interesting, because I'm so happy to hear you talk about that Ophelia painting, because in my mood board that painting is there before I ever made the film. And so so that's actually very meaningful to me, that it's like, wow, that you could see that. And I wanted her to feel like not real, like she's not wearing a normal dress that everyone wanders around with. I kind of like to think maybe it was her wedding dress or something, but she's not a normal person. She's not abiding by the rules of like wearing the white dress that, you know, you might expect. And we it's like, if I look back at and it's still online, my Kickstarter campaign for that, and I did a little film talking about how I was going to film it and how we were going to have this static camera in this room, and then gradually then move to handheld, and then go to this beach and use a drone and be totally free. And so that even with the use of how the camera was used is a gradual kind of progression till it's completely free and flying. And And so that was quite deliberate. The close up in the van was a beautiful moment, because poor Tanya was stuck between the two of them, like with them driving down the road with her back, and looking up. And there's some great photos of us sort of crammed in there in this wretched van, which it was such a lovely van. But we shot the bit in Camden first, very early in the morning, and then we had to drive to the North Norfolk coast in that van. And Rob, the actor, was so brilliant. He actually drove it there, and it was very touch and go. It's like we stalled on Highgate Hill, and the sports car behind us wouldn't let us back up so that we could get a run at it, and the van in front wouldn't stop, wouldn't move, and we just thought we'd never going to get there. And we had a window of 4 hours to film at that beach because of the tide and also the cost. And it's a nature reserve, and to be allowed to use the drone, we had to have people there to make sure we didn't kill any endangered species. And the whole thing was so complicated for a first film. And it's just really nice to hear when you say those things, because they weren't intentional, but some things obviously happen just because you're there. And every time I went to that beach, there was different weather. Some days it was beautiful sun and rain every 5 minutes. And then that day, it was 21st of June, should have been a beautiful, long, wonderful day. And it rained all day, heavily, as we drove up there. And then we got there was this amazing sea mist, and everyone had been like terrified of what it was going to be like on the beach, and really disappointed, and like, oh, it's going to be awful, and it's so wet. And then we got there, and it was deserted and just this magical sea mist. And I thought, well, we're blessed that it rained all day and everyone went home, and this is what it is. And it turned out to be the perfect thing on midsummer, that it would look like that.
Yeah, I actually, with the mist, I actually had wondered whether or not maybe you'd filmed it like sort of first thing in the morning before all the swimmers came out. It was just obviously meant to be.
Tanya had wanted to do it early morning, but the schedule wouldn't allow for that. And so instead we were there from 5 till 9 in the evening, and the light was fading and the sea was rolling in or out. I can't remember. I think we must have been going out. We went there at high tide because we didn't want to drown, because it's a very dangerous beach. And then we followed the tide out, and then of course we had about a mile to walk back with all our kit across the stand afterwards. But it is a wonderful place, and it was an amazing experience. It was, and that moment where she walks away, I couldn't believe it came out so well.
And the way that the drone sort of like pulls out at level, and then like by the time it starts to go up, it gives that feeling that she was like disappearing into the mist. Like, you couldn't do better with CGI.
No, I mean, and it was real. It was kind of, poor Ashen's like walking away down the beach with the drone following her, and you can sort of see everyone like, well, how far is she going to go? And I'm like, no, let her go. And then it's like, back up. And this thing sort of zooms back away from her and up through the birds. And it was, I mean, then we had to try and get her back because she couldn't hear us. So, but yeah, I mean, both she and Rob were amazing on that. They really put up with some freezing cold weather and kind of difficult journey up there, and everyone was exhausted. And then the next 2 days we went to the funeral parlor and did the toughest scenes, really. Emotionally speaking.
Amazing. I feel I'm hogging all of the questions here, so I feel I should open out to the floor. Would anyone else like to ask some questions of Karen? Please feel free to unmute yourselves, or put your hand up, or Helen, feel free to put something in the chat. If not, I have. Sorry, it's quite dark here, and my My lamps aren't working, and my eyesight is very poor. Excuse me.
I can see a question about the
Oh, lovely, Sophia, from Simon. Yeah, what reactions has the film had from the Jewish community?
well, that's been interesting. I did so before I made the film, I had sent the script to the Jewish International Film Festival here in London, because they have funding for 2 films a year. And I got to the final 5, and they really loved it, but they didn't believe I could do it as my first film. They thought it was just, I wasn't going to be able to pull that off. So in the end, I didn't get the funding, but I'd done so much work towards that that we just walked away and said, okay, well, we'll make it anyway. And which we did. And then they screened it the following year 3 times in their festival. So they had a very positive response to it. They enjoyed that it's challenging. And I think, I think that a lot of people who I talked to at the festival had said that, well, it's just a very common experience that people are moving away from your faith, and how do you deal with that? And it's a complex thing. But I will say, when I went to the Death and the Maiden conference, we did a panel, and there was a woman from America who's originally Israeli, and initially she was quite aggressive and judgmental, and felt that I was misrepresenting her faith. But we had a good conversation, and I was able to, say, well, this is the problem, isn't it? We all have a different take on it. My Jewish family is not the same as another Jewish family. My assistant director is an Israeli filmmaker. And she's a great fan of the film, obviously. She took part in it. So I think you have to accept that if you make a film that is a bit challenging in some ways, then you are going to have that conversation. And I think some of the more general film festivals, I did get the sense that people were nervous about showing that film if they weren't a Jewish film festival. It was like, well, is this saying something that would be offensive? Rather than seeing it just as a story about a family. And that's a problem with the way the world is, that we all should be sensitive and think about that. But if you cannot have a conversation about everyone's experience, it's just not a good place to be in, I think.
Yeah. So. And we have thank you for that. We have a lovely question also from Sergio. Do you think that this story could be a starting point for a longer exploration of the topic of dealing with faith and family rules?
Yeah, it could. I have to say, when I made the short, I kind of thought I would really like to explore this and tell more of the story, and maybe even the story of what happens after, because the father has had this terrible experience and loss, and wondering what would happen to him and the rest of the family that there was surely there, and his wife, who was brokenhearted. And and so I think there's so many stories you can tell. I know that, like in my own life, when my father died, because he was a musician, there was a massive party, loads of alcohol, everyone partying, telling jokes. And for my grandfather, that was hugely painful, because he was this very sensible kind of middle management guy who just didn't want them to do that. And it was so painful. And so I think it's kind of an interesting thing to explore, how one thing is not good for another person. It's like and so there's loads of scope for a bigger exploration of it, maybe a series even, of really, I mean, I know that Ricky Gervais has kind of nailed that, but but yeah, I could see doing something longer at a later time. Yeah.
And Helen has added on to that of faith and death, which is, again, very, very good point.
Yeah. Yeah, because we all have different traditions, and now some of us are just making them up as we go along. If we don't fit in one place, we just create our own sort of traditions, in a sense.
Yeah, and I suppose there is also a conversation that, that diversity, nothing wrong with a bit of diversity, and I suppose one of the ideas that your film opens up is that, is the funeral for the sake of the departed, or for those who are left behind.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. But it's a very good question.
No, but one thing I did find out at the Death and the Maiden conference, which it's in the film, but I hadn't really realized I was correct in it, that because now there's it wasn't then when I made it, but now there's endless things on daytime TV saying, oh, plan your own funeral. I mean, everyone's sitting around very cheerfully, with glasses of wine, saying, oh, you don't have to have a funeral for me, and I and that's the way it is. But one of the things that came out of it is that you can leave a will, you can say what you want, but actually the rights exist with the people who are left behind. It isn't your right to choose what your funeral is. If it is, so they were saying, we were talking about how you have to have that conversation, and it's a problem for people who are estranged from their families, so who don't fit in with their family's religion or whatever, because this is the only thing that saved Rachel, was that she'd actually married him, and therefore Rob, the character, was her next of kin. Otherwise her father could have walked out with her corpse and done whatever he wanted. So it's still an ongoing thing of how much we really have control. We kind of think we do, and now we're all so frightened of dying, we want to feel like we have control after. But it's about communicating what you want, and trying to and to build the relationships where what you want and what expresses your beliefs and is respected, even if it's difficult for those people who are left behind. So
that's an excellent point. I want to turn briefly to the father. The actor who played the father, I thought, was wonderful, because he had all the anger, but he also had the anguish.
yeah.
And a part of you sort of wanted to sort of say, oh, you silly man, but also just wanted to like give him a hug. How did you come across him?
Well, that was interesting. It was quite because the whole thing happened quite quickly. Once it did, it was quite hard to find someone in the time available, and then it just happened that we were looking at lots of pictures, and then the director of photography, Tanya, said, oh, I remember this guy, Johnny Moran, when I was in Manchester, and he she I think maybe he would be right. He looks like these people you're kind of saying might be good for the role. And she showed me a photograph, and so I rang his agent, and we had this lovely conversation. Back then it was Skype, no Zoom. And he was in like on the coast outside of Manchester, and what was so interesting is that he just personally bought into it, because he was telling me that 25 years earlier he had been in love with a woman when he was much younger, and he wanted to spend his life with her, but she was Jewish, and her father had forbade her from marrying him, and she ended up going to Israel and marrying someone else, and they had just got back in contact because she was now single. And so he's like, well, right after I finish this shoot, I'm going to Israel to see the girl I lost. And so it was really, I don't know what happened about that after. So I've seen, Johnny since. He's a wonderful person, wonderful actor, and a good laugh, and also a musician. So, but that was such a beauty. Again, it sort of felt like a fate, saying this is just, you never know who you know, and then you never know what the connection that will bring someone to your project is. But he really understood the character and the pain, and he was remarkable, really. again, had to deal with a lot of stuff, like having to do the whole thing on not very much, well, almost no rehearsal, to be honest, because we didn't have time, and having to come in having not been at the beach. And I think that was the weird thing, is we had a very small crew for the beach scenes, which we did first, and then the people who were in that funeral space had not seen that, had no idea where the film was going in the end, really. And so I think it was a bit of a mystery to them. They just, yeah. And funnily enough, a lot of film people, when you say, oh, would you like to read the script, and you'll get some assistant camera person who just looks at you like you're deranged. It's like, no, I'm here to focus this, I don't care about the story. And it was like, really? Yeah. And so it that I found quite funny on my first experience through, that some of them really just weren't interested until they saw the final thing, and then they're like, oh, that's why. Oh, right, okay. So for Johnny to be in that scene with those two actors who'd already done that thing, I think he was he did a really great job. Yeah.
And was, because like, you know, in that scene we hear Rachel's voice. I'm assuming that was like voiceover afterwards.
Yes, we recorded that in my mum's kitchen under a blanket. It was a bit crazy, yes. And we had to do a little bit of special VFX work afterwards, because, you know, I'm sat there watching it, and I probably watched it hundreds of times before I kept worrying that there was something I could see, and we finally realized that her little toe moved once, and so while she was in the coffin, and so we were like, and it was, so we had to magically stop that moving, and that took quite a long time. It was really interesting. So the magic of film is brilliant. That and the fact that, you know, I look back and think that room with the coffin had about 12 people in it at nearly all the time, and you can't see them, and it's a tiny room. It really is, you know, it's really very small, and people were underneath and round the corner and behind things trying to get out of view. So I love that. That's one of the things I like about filmmaking, is that you kind of create this real world that you disappear everything else. Yeah,
that's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you. Did anyone have any other questions, or Karen, is there anything in particular that you'd like to say about the film?
No, I'm just very glad that it's out there still, being more than I ever expected it would be. I guess that people, you know, I've had people write to me, a guy from America who saw it in a festival, who wrote and said how he's gay. He was not allowed to go to his partner's funeral because he wasn't married to him, couldn't be at the time, and how much, and I think that's what I like about the film, is it means different things to different people. That, you know, someone I know who was extremely upset at one of the screenings was because her child had an eating disorder, and it's that sort of, so you can take up different things. It's about, how do I respect someone's individuality? How do I not lose my child because we disagree? So I think it's that's the biggest joy for me in the film, is it's more than I ever anticipated it could be.
Lovely. And so tell us about the projects that you're working on now.
Right, well, I'm hoping to make my first feature film this year, but that's all bound up in the magic of how do you get the right cast, as I said. And I just made a short film called Firebird, which is about a musician in a surreal lockdown. It's one that's gone on for like 5,000 days, and it's in a sort of an otherworldly, surreal place that doesn't really exist. But it's about the pain of losing music and not being allowed to play, and the pain that my colleagues and I have gone through in not being able to do the things that we express ourselves through. So and that was part of a group project with Europeans in multiple different countries that started during lockdown, and that wider thing is called Edifice 129. We each made films which are going to be cut into pieces and interlocked together to make one story. So although mine exists in its own right, it will also be part of another story that all works together, even though we had to shoot in different countries all at the same time.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
So it's supposed to be in the same location, and hopefully eventually the magic of film will create this world where you believe that they're all in the same place. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at the moment, hopefully. But the feature film is very different from Rachel, although it does also feature a deceased girl who you can hear and see. So different but the same.
And no doubt fantastic music that isn't put in there to save the scene.
There will be. I've got Nikki Wells is composing that music, and she was in Nit and Sawney's band for many, many years. So she's an incredible singer and songwriter in her own right, and she writes for ballet and opera as well. So yeah, so she's going to be doing kind of a country western bluesy soundtrack, but also some edgy kind of steely sounds and things. So yeah, it's going to be a really good soundtrack, actually. Yeah,
that's wonderful. Karen, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolute privilege. I could keep talking for hours about Rachel because I just love it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for creating that wonderful wonderful piece of art and bringing it out into the world. And please thank your mother-in-law for having had that conversation with you that started it all off. Yeah, Helen says thank you, and thanks for the film. It was great.
You. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing it with people. It's been just wonderful. I'm really proud. Okay.
Thanks.